my talk today about the biobanking in developing countries, and we will give a little story about our biobanking in Upper Egypt. The overview of the lectures is the biobank as a platform. It's important, the disease burden in developing countries, and a way forward, and a little story in our institute, and then how it's enough toward a global consumption of biobanking or not, and the conclusions. Biobanking is now an integral part of modern-day medical research, and giving the comparatively high research budget of first-world countries, it is not surprising that most biobanks are establishing in worthwhile parts of the world, but we are here in the developing countries. What about the developing countries? Developing countries struggles with the impact of disease on a massive scale. Doesn't it make sense to build biobanking there as well or not? Unfortunately, the answers to that questions is not exactly clear-cut. For starters, only 10% of research is dedicated to disease that burden developing region. Plus, developing countries typically lack the research capacity and infrastructure needed to support towards modern facilities. A few biobanks have already been established in developing countries such as Chinese, Mexico, and the Gambian National DNA Bank as a national overview or a national biobanking, not an individual's biobanking. These studies are not sufficiently representative of the major causes death and disability in developing countries or the age group at which disease strikes, in particularly HIV, TB, malaria, that requires larger studies in diverse population. What about the disease burden in these developing countries? Developing countries, unlike most developed countries, suffers from the dual burden of the chronic diseases and infectious diseases. Already 4 out of 5 chronic diseases deaths occur in developing countries. Another cause is the genetic and environmental variation. The genetic and environmental variation that contribute to complex chronic diseases are not necessarily the same in geographically segregated populations. Indeed, common chronic diseases can have surprisingly correlates. And 2 small studies in India and in Iraq found that low body mass and diabetes were correlated with TB history and a positive tuberculin test. Respectively, also other studies correlate some cancers with other genetic or chronic diseases. And over 90% of the global burden of the disease is in developing countries, yet only 10% of global research addresses many of these diseases. So biobanks are, and also the biobank are infrastructures for sustained research on the biological determinants of disease and promise to accelerate the discovery of vaccines, drugs, and diagnosis. So, we are in need, and very in need, biobank in the developing world to establish the research on its own diseases and correlated with the genetics disease. لو سمحت هي بتتغير هنا بس مش بتتغير في ال. Okay? Thank you. So, as we said, it's very important to develop biobanks in the developing world to establish its own research on its chronic diseases and its genetic variations and environmental variations. However, distribution and focus of current biobanks suggests that their discoveries will not sufficiently benefit these living in developing countries. Why? Typical biobanks are expensive, particularly because of that the serum sample and they collect and keep must be kept cold continuously, and coarse tissue samples need more freezing. So the simplest biobank need freezers, many, cryopreservations, and database. And the challenge we will see is the first one is the refrigeration of the biobanks is expensive and require a reliable electric supply, not only the electric supply but also a cold environment. we put our refrigerators in cold room because we are in a hot area. The second challenge is to address ethical concerns associated with collected and storing samples from people of different cultures. The third is the logistical issue of sample collections in regions with limited access to medical facilities. The fourth one is the advances in technology, especially in genetics, in separation of the DNA, RNA, and keeping it for a long period. And the last is the data registry in medical field and its accessibility. It's not easy in our region. So that added for the basic risk of biobanking with understanding of the science, privacy, confidentiality, access by user, and social discriminations. But on the other side, even so, more and more people in the medical research community argue that establishing biobank in developing countries is an effective way to research disease and could lead to rapid, excited, and valuable discoveries. So we started here in Egypt, many individuals biobankers. Our story is in South Egypt Cancer Institute in Asiyut, and this is our contacts. Our aim in the CC Biobank is to provide a single comprehensive organized collections of probably prepared and retrievable tissue, blood, and body fluid for use in future research studies of cancer, because our scope is only in cancer. So patients under the care of the doctors in South Egypt Cancer Institute with the diagnosis of any type of cancer, any age, and any gender, after written consent, are eligible for storing his samples in our bank. Blood collected on admissions and at the time of surgery and or time of the clinical visit, and also the tissue collected from the cancer patients were undergoing surgery. And we collect whole blood and mononuclear samples and separate from it plasma, serum, and also we collect fluids and urine, stem cells, and finally tissue. And also finally we separated DNA and RNA, but only for the quality control samples. All the data computerized recorded are maintained for all proposed tissue and cells and connected in the health information system in our institute. We overcame the ethical barriers by getting the acceptance of the ethical committee in South Egypt Cancer Institute, choosing the best evidence-based SOPs that fit with our workflow. Quality is critical in every process, and we now and then examine the DNA and RNA quality of our blood samples and tissue samples. Is that enough toward a global consumption of biobanks? Of course not. National or regional biobank, or at least national networks as a first step. Others have called of the global consumption of biobanks as address common ethical issue, data ownership and data sharing, and that's really our problem here. First, joint analysis of important but uncommon gene variant will be needed to generate more definitely results than can be generated from the individual. And the second, that reasonable expectations from funders and beneficiaries will push toward collaboration, as has happened with the Human Genome Project. As we all know, the individuals cannot go more than the group. So we can call for the development of human biobanks in developing countries, and developing human biobanks in developing countries requires a strengthening of the research capacity. And also we conclude a responsible approach from developing countries to ethical issue will be another challenge. National and international networks will increase the benefit. And we believe that research into health problems of low-income countries may be a better places for human biobanks, and it may result in more obvious success. And we all believe that from simplest things, we can jump toward excellence. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Professor دعاء. It's a story of success because biobanking is very important as you are going to the era of personalized medicine. So keep on.
Thank you, Dr. Magdi. Thank
Any
you.
questions?